We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
As the saying goes, politics is downstream from culture, meaning that what happens in our society is eventually reflected in the quality and type of politicians and politics we end up with. You might say society as a whole gets the politicians it deserves. But what happens when the politicians try to influence the culture, when they become the change agents? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We have a fantastic show lined up for you today. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. On today's show, we'll be talking about how the government wants to get in on the Bitcoin and Cryptocurrency Act, how women may soon be eligible for the draft to the front line in any looming conflict, what's the politics behind it, and who's the driving force. We'll also be discussing why flyover country is feeling the burn of an increasingly coastally focused government. And we'll be checking out the latest stories that impact you and your right to freedom. All this and a whole lot more on Liberty Nation Radio. With the prospect of women being eligible for the draft, should the need arise, speculation is in the air as to whether the initial idea of allowing combat roles for females was the first step in this process, and whether those who sought equality in all aspects of life have bitten off more than they can actually chew. To help us dig deeper on this topic, we're joined by Dave Patterson, Liberty Nation author, retired U.S. Air Force pilot, and former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller. Welcome, Dave.
Mark, always good to be with you.
So please, first, give us the background. What does this mean for everyday American women?
Well, I think that this is the first step coming through the Senate Armed Services Committee. And what this means for women is that it's coming closer to being an authorization and put into law that women ages 18 to 31 will also be eligible for the draft. From a practical standpoint, no one's been drafted for a very long time. The last person, I believe, was in 1973. And so from a practical standpoint, I think it's a administrative exercise for women. And but keep in mind that this is not the first time this has been considered. In 2016, a similar provision was passed in the Senate and was never brought to the floor. It was dropped from the National Defense Authorization Act and never came to a floor vote.
So this could be merely a symbolic gesture on the part of politicians, right?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, there are serious people who think that this is an important step in fairness, and it might be also good to note that the same people who believe in this fairness are the same people who will never have to suffer the consequences of these actions.
As is always the case, Dave. Now, I believe that the U.S. operated the draft system from the 50s through the 70s. As you mentioned, you think the last person was 1973. That covered the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Now, if this comes to fruition, would this be the same draft procedure? And in reality, could we see women sent to the front lines if war breaks out?
I think if it came to extremists, that would be the case. But we've had the draft around or something similar since the Revolutionary War. It was invested in the states to muster a militia, and so this has been part of the American landscape for quite some time. Various levels of structure and discipline put into it, but nonetheless, it's been around. This is the first time, however, since 2016, where people have been serious about drafting women.
Okay, I mean, it seems to me that there are historically, from a war point of view, good reasons why it's only ever been what's unfortunately termed disposable men who get drafted. I mean, who would run the country back home? As we saw during the First and Second World War, this was a time when women stepped up and essentially ran the industry of our nations. Who gives birth to the next generation? Have these things even been considered, or are they on the altar or on the chopping block?
I think they have been considered, and I think in somewhat of a perverse way, it's been somewhat of the argument on the side for drafting women that they're equally capable of doing all manner of things as they were in World War II. It's interesting to note that 66% of all the people who fought in World War II were inductees. And it ended up being registered were about 15 million, about 10 million were called up, leaving the home front to be administered by women who did a magnificent job.
True, true. Now, if I were a gambling woman aged between 18 and 31, Dave, I'd be looking at the gambling odds for a conflict under the present political climate. How are my odds looking?
I think your odds of being called up are reasonably good. I mean, the mechanics of it alone would speak to the fact that someone, even today, without any real legislation being passed, the legislation is passed, it'll be a year before anything would ever be manifested in a mechanical, structured way for the Selective Service. And then it would only be in extremis. And today we see wars, and they happen very quickly. And I think that women being called up would be more of a symbol, a gesture that says we are in fact investing our country in this effort.
Yeah, it's not such a question of investing the country there with the act of putting women forward on the front lines of an actual war. That's investing the future of the country, I'd argue.
And I think you're right. I think that it is an aspect of this whole debate that people forget. And that is, they have this image of being drafted. You come into the service, you get your uniform, and life is wonderful. That's not the case. You come in, and they will put you where you are needed. And if that's a frontline combat unit, then congratulations. That's where you're going, whether you're male or female, according to this provision in the NDAA.
So what's the political split on this, Dave? Who's for it and who's against it?
Well, as you might suspect, conservatives are less enthusiastic, and for the most part, they do not support this provision. Democrats do. And you can see the breakout in the SASC, the Senate Armed Services Committee, where you had two Republicans, Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas and Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, who broke ranks with the minority leader, Senator Inhofe. But you have to remember that this was a $740 billion authorization. And you're not going to stop it. It has a momentum of its own. So the hope is that, once again, it will go to the House, where you have House members who are much closer to their constituency, who will vote it down, or in the case of 2016, never brought it to the floor.
So it's the attached pork that's adding the extra weight, that's barreling it towards completion, I would imagine.
Well, it certainly is the attached money and the various constituencies for that money.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Mark, always good to be with you. Thank you.
And don't touch that dial. Later in the show, we're going to be looking at how a juggernaut against your liberties is fast approaching. We'll be right back on Liberty Nation Radio after this short break. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.